Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the RM Karma Doctoral Students and Junior Faculty Consortium. Today is the last session of our consortium, and we are having an editorial panel on how to manage methodological hurdles during the publication process. We have three amazing speakers today who will be sharing their experience and expertise with us. I'll do a little bit of introduction and then we'll start our session today. So first, we have Dr. Beth Becky, who is the Stephen Newberry Chair of Leadership at the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on theoretical complexity of the modern workplace, and she's the associate editor of Administrative Science Quarterly. Next, we have Dr. Joachim Henkel, who is the professor of Technology and Innovation Management at Technical University of Munich. His research focuses on patent management, standards, technology acquisition, digitalization, and innovation. And he's currently the associate editor of Academy of Management Discoveries. And finally, we have Dr. Jonas Lang, who is an associate professor of personal management at Ghent University. And his work focuses on adaptability, cognitive abilities, personal selection, and the influence of motivation on performance. And he's currently the associate editor of Journal of Applied Psychology. So thank you, all of you, for taking the time today to join us and share your perspective and experience with us. I'm sure our participants will greatly benefit from your insight today. So the way that we've organized this session is that we have each of you present for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll open it up as a panel discussion and allow attendees to ask questions and then do a quick Q&A discussion. So feel free to type in your questions as we go through each presentations, and at the end I'll moderate these questions, and so that we have we get the insights from our panelists on all of the questions. So without further ado, Dr. Becky, if you would like to start, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. And thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. I feel like as a representative sort of ASQ, I was going to start with a little, can you see? Okay, great. I was going to start off just briefly by telling you a tiny bit about ASQ in case you're interested in submitting there at some point. ASQ is basically an organizations journal. We are open to a broad range of perspectives and methods, but topically we're focusing on publishing papers that advance understanding of organizing. And so I think in general, what the reputation of ASQ is pretty accurate in that ASQ is kind of a theory forward journal. We're a journal that kind of expects papers to be empirically rigorous, but also make a theoretical contribution to the field. And just some stats on ASQ, basically, we had almost 600 submissions last year. The acceptance rate is pretty low, 4 to 6%, but that's like probably around the average for journals in our field. Turnaround times have been improving. More about 30% of the submissions to ASQ are qualitative methods. And I would say one of the things not on this slide, but that's really important maybe to some of the attendees here, is that ASQ is very dissertation friendly. So I encourage you to send your dissertation research to the journal. In the last several years, about 40 to 50% of the papers published in ASQ have been based on dissertations. We have an annual award for best paper based on a dissertation, so please send your dissertations. Submission process, I just wanted to give you some logistical notes, and I actually think these are pretty across the board what you would expect at a journal, at a top journal. But what I wanted to add is that, and I think this is true too of most journals, ASQ has a ton of useful information in the invitation to contributors, right? You should always read, when you're going to submit to a journal, you should read that information. because that will help you craft a paper that will get accepted to the journal, right? So please have a look at all that information. And there are details about writing for ASQ. There are more details about data transparency, which has become increasingly important in the field. How to format your paper, what are the frequently asked questions, especially if you've never submitted to the journal before, that you should read these. And much of what I'm going to say, sort of the general ideas about how to submit a paper and what makes a good paper submission, come out of a lot of that material. And so I'm kind of drawing out what I think are the key points. And I would say the other thing that's maybe different about ASQ than other journals is that ASQ does not have a page limit. However, that does not mean that we don't care and you can send us an 80-page paper. So I will note that as an associate editor, if your paper comes in and I think it's too long, I will tell our managing editor to send it back to you and shorten it before you resubmit it, right? So please think about length to contribution ratio, even though ASQ does not have an official page limit. Okay, now on to the stuff that's, I think, more interesting. In terms of how you craft a submission and the best submission to a journal, I think part of it is about telling a compelling story. And to do that, one of the things we care about is making a sufficient contribution to theory. And so what that means is you want to think about, why does what you're saying matter? So not just here's this study, but why is what I've studied important? Thinking about, what have we learned from the study that we didn't know before? Or another way of thinking that is, well, what are our priors here, and how can we update those given what we found in this study? And then I think it's important to recognize that you want to frame your paper not with every theoretical perspective in the world that might apply, but to be narrower and have maybe one or two theoretical lines of argument that you're going to draw on to kind of frame the paper. So a foreground theory, that's the one that matters most, and maybe some background theory, but like the kitchen sink, we don't want to see that. We want to see that there's a sort of theory is driving what you're doing. And then in terms of data and analysis, you want to think about, is this the best data I've got? You should always be submitting based on the best data that you can collect and send, right? Are you using the best analytic techniques? And then linking between the data and the theory is also really important. So noting, okay, does this data actually fit the theoretical angle that I'm trying to take on the paper? In other words, do I have the right data to answer the questions that I'm asking? And then also linking between your data and sort of your contribution, what is it that you've come up with? Does your data actually show what it is that you say that it's showing? And this is particularly, I'm a qualitative scholar, so this is particularly true with qualitative data. I will often read paragraphs and findings and tell people, you know what, this doesn't say what I think you think it says, right? Like what people are telling you, I don't see the theoretical kind of aha from it that you seem to be seeing. So you need to clarify that data is showing what you're claiming that it's showing. I think the other thing that's really important is knowing the journal that you're submitting to before you start writing can really be helpful. So like you have 3 different journals represented here among the panelists, but also just more broadly, we have a lot of different journals. You want to think about, who's the appropriate audience for this paper? So thinking about, if I'm going to send to ASQ, which is sort of a general organization's audience, I'm going to craft the paper differently than if I were to send it to, say, JAP or, I don't know, AJS, right? Those are very different audiences for the paper. So you want to think about, what is the scholarly conversation that you're wanting to enter? And when you're doing that, what literature can you expect that audience that you're talking to know? Because that's going to change how you write your paper. For a general audience, you tend to need to be, you have to be less jargon laden, right? You have to speak to sort of more the lay person, and know that you have to explain conceptually some of the things that maybe a narrower psychological or sociological audience might need. And then also, given all of that, what's the contribution that you're making given the literature that you're speaking to? And I would add, one of the tactics or techniques that I use to do this is anytime I write for a new journal, I find 5 papers published in that particular journal in a research area close to what I'm writing about, and I read them very carefully. And what I do is I kind of reverse outline them. I look at the structure of the papers. What does this journal expect in terms of a method section? What do they expect in terms of a discussion section? And I kind of then not copy those papers, but they give you a sense for how is the paper in this journal structured? What are the expectations around what the discussion section is going to say or what the literature review looks like? So I recommend doing that anytime you start with a new audience. I find that very helpful. And the other thing in here, I'm drawing very much on Linda Johansson's paper, which I have a cite for at the end here. I think that one of the other things you want to think about is, how do I get my reviewers on board really with my manuscript? And Linda has some great ideas for how to do that. Thinking about establishing your contribution really quickly is something that's important to do, because remember, your reviewers have, limited amounts of time. And so they're going to be looking for what's important. Again, why is this finding or what you've done important to the field, to our understanding of theory? You want to make that clear in the first couple of pages and make sure that you're kind of establishing who your audience is and what the literature is, what we know in the literature, and why it matters that you're addressing those questions about what we know and don't know, right? So you should have what is known and what is not known, and then why it matters. What question it is you're answering. I'm always surprised at the number of papers I receive that you can't figure out what the question is that the author is exploring. That's really important. And then why is your study appropriate for answering it? So saying nobody has studied this before, for instance, is not a good motivation for doing a project. And I'm sure it isn't the motivation that anybody chooses when they start a research project. But you can see people smiling. As editors, we see this a lot. Saying it hasn't been studied before is not enough. Why do we care that it hasn't been studied before, right? So the other thing is, remember who your reviewers are. This is your audience. These are the people you want to read and understand your work and cite your work, right? So saying all of these people did it all wrong, first of all, probably not true. Second of all, this is your audience. These are the people you want to read your paper. You don't want to tell them you are all dead wrong. Okay, so keep those two things in mind as you work through the literature, because I think that those are like kind of pitfalls that I see in a lot of papers that you should avoid. And then lastly, I think what you want to do, and here's sort of an easy checklist for whether or not this paper is going to speak to your audience. Review it before you submit it. Look at, are you defining all of your key terms as you go along? Don't make your reader assume what definitions are you using. Again, we're a broad field. We have lots of different reviewers reading your paper. Your audience is broad. So you want to make sure that you're clear. Also, acronyms. Avoid creating new ones. Nobody's going to recognize your acronym as they read through your paper. So these are rarely helpful to your reader. So and can be very confusing. So avoid using new acronyms. If you can explain your idea without using technical terms, I recommend that you try to do that. If you can't, make sure you're defining your terms clearly. Don't repeat things. Avoiding repetition. A lot of repetition is good. Proofreading. What do I want to say about that? I find that reviewers don't like typos. You almost will always see reviewers will get at the bottom of their review. If you've got a lot of typos in your paper, or you haven't proofread your paper, it sort of makes reviewers think that you are sloppy as a scholar. Don't be sloppy. It takes an hour or two to proofread your paper before you send it out for review. You should do it very carefully and make sure that it fits the guidelines for formatting. You know, the basic stuff can give hints to reviewers that you're not a careful person if you don't take care of those things. So please pay attention to detail. And then I think this is like the most important thing I wanted to say. Remember that you're a part of a community. So friendly reviews are really important before you submit a paper to a journal. So the thing to do is to ask trusted peers for feedback, and then actually listen to that feedback, right? So, and I will add, you know, when I graduated with my PhD, my advisor stopped reading my work. Like, you know, he had too many other students. There was no way he was, so I would send papers to him and he would be like, yeah, that's fine, without actually reading it. Okay, that's not good enough. Don't ask your advisor to proofread your work or really look closely at a paper, give you a friendly review. They've seen your papers too much. You know, they just are too rooted in what you've done. You should have trusted peers who are not your dissertation committee. And these are going to be the folks moving forward in your career who are going to be really important to helping you do good work, right? So ask these trusted folks for feedback, and then make sure you make those changes before you send the paper out for review, because they're representatives of the community who's your audience. And these people can really be helpful in helping you craft a manuscript that's going to make it past that first round of revision. Okay, so my last slide is basically just a set of helpful resources that I find useful when thinking about how to craft papers for submission. Like I said, a lot of what I drew on here is from Linda Johansson, was the managing editor of ASQ for 25 years. And she has a paper in JMI that I find like it just really nails, like in 5 pages, like what are the key things to think about when you're writing a manuscript to send it out to a journal. And then I also really love Karen Golden-Biddle and Karen Locke's work. They have a whole set of like kind of meta-analysis of how to write papers. And they're focused on qualitative work, but I think many of their points actually also apply to much quantitative work when you're thinking about crafting an argument, which is a really important part of developing a good paper. So I recommend these highly. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Beth. Appreciate it. So I just wanted to mention again that you can type in your questions as we go, and then at the end I'll ask those questions. And next we have Joachim, Dr. Joachim Henkel. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Share my screen here. So you should see my screen. Can you not?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, thanks, Beth, for going first and for this excellent talk. I mean, 80% of what you said, I think I can absolutely echo, and probably most editors can. So certainly the things about, yeah, nobody has done this before is not a good argument. Why you're doing this? Also, don't say everybody before has done it wrong, because that's not only your audience, it's also your reviewers, and they might not like you for that. And make good use of friendly reviewers. 2 more points I would echo even more loudly, because I think they're especially important for AMD, because it is still a relatively young journal. So this is also why I'm, as Beth just did, for a much more established journal, I will tell you a bit about the journal and then specifically talk about methods. But basically we'll be saying that we are agnostic about methods. So it's more, how do you support your story? So AMD is the Academy of Management Discoveries, and journal aims to be, or probably there are not that many dedicated journals. So it aims to be the premier management journal for empirical exploration. Who are the people behind it? In the current term of editors, there's Kevin Rockman, an excellent editor-in-chief who puts in a lot of effort, incredible guy and super nice guy too. And there's the rest of the team, and there too. So what's the point? I think in the last maybe 10 years or so, there's been a general push for, well, a higher regard for the phenomena, which I really love because I'm a physicist by training. So I did physics, studied a German diploma, which is equivalent to a master's degree. And in physics, very often things are being discovered and nobody knows an explanation for them. So theory needs to be extended. If you write up such a story and send them to AMJ, they are appalled. Because to start with theory, you need to theoretically derive something, which happens in physics as well. So Einstein had his theory of general relativity before anybody could empirically confirm it. Excellent. But there's also the other case that somebody finds measurements of neutrinos and nobody has a theory for neutrinos. So they start looking for one. That's the kind of stuff that AMD publishes. And here are a bunch of quotes that I think reflect the truth. And also other journals have this. I'm actually currently the INR from SMJ, which is not theoretically based paper, but rather the other way around, starting with the phenomenon. So it gets more possible to publish this kind of stuff, but AMD is really focused on. So keywords here are the blue boxes: abductive reasoning, pragmatism in organization studies. Then the question if there may be too much of a good thing of theory in some cases. Here the point about a discovery. So I discovered something. And I will give you examples of what that means or what that can mean. Problematizing, meaning you observe something that is problematic because you can't easily explain it. It's also the next point here: poorly understood phenomena that you can't easily explain with existing theory. Stylized fact is something you can derive from that, and maybe overarching openness in research reporting. How have you proceeded in your research, rather than what sometimes happens, right? You look at some data, you discover something, and then you draw up hypotheses. Maybe not you, but it has happened, I've heard. So taking all these together describes roughly the idea and the mission of Academy of Management Discovery. Here's a nice quote: good theory comes from engagement with problems in the world, not gaps in the literature. I would kind of tone this down a bit. It can come from gaps in the literature, obviously. I mean, that is theoretically derived. But very often it does come from engagement with the real world. And again, this is for AMD. And I'm repeating that because, as I said, it's a relatively young journal still, 10 years or something like that. And we keep sometimes getting manuscripts where you saw, oh, that had been with a theory first journal, then somebody deleted the hypothesis or not even that and send it to us. Not good. That won't work. Sometimes you can rewrite a paper for AMD, sometimes it's just not possible. In any case, as Beth also said about ASQ, you need to write in such a way that it fits the journal. So read a bunch of papers, take a template or two, and learn how to write for that specific journal. So why an AMD? You may have compelling findings you can't completely explain. I will give you an example in a minute. You want to maybe creatively, and actually AMD is also innovative in some respects about what you can show. It's purely online, I should say, as a footnote here, pure online journal. And the budget that we don't use for printing this stuff is invested into things like animated whiteboards. So a little cartoon at the beginning, which is really nicely and professionally done. You can have animated charts. You have author's voice, so little spoken text snippets in the article, in the online article, which I think is actually very rich, better than a naked PDF or just paper. So you can immerse your audience in your context and phenomena. You can start with a story and describe the research process, and you can also transparently describe how you proceed. Here are two examples. One is here about by Barnett et al. The benefits of CSR. So it's not just helping firms to suffer less harm from negative events, as has been described, but also helps them to protect from such events in the first place. Another one is about drugs. So the authors here explore how the practices of two non-profit organizations allowed them to circumvent the endemic market and government failures involving positive externalities by using generic drug repurposing. Repurposing means finding for an existing drug a new application, and so getting the certification for that is much faster and easier than starting a whole new process from scratch, because you don't need to show that it doesn't have too bad side effects. So here's a bit more detail which I would like to skip. So phenomenon, what are we talking about? And then discovery, what's the surprising stuff? And again, the keywords here, a journal for empirical exploration of compelling phenomena. It is not for deductive theorizing or hypothesis testing. However, it is expected that you, in the end, that you not just show your data and say, oh, look, isn't that amazing? Something new that I can't explain. You should please then provide an explanation, which can be a hypothetical, so excuse the word confusion. So it can be a potential one, and then you try as good as you can to exclude some explanations that are possible, but in the end not applicable. But try to say, okay, so here's the one where I can't find any test that refutes it. It would still open the door for future hypothesis-based work. In any case, we expect theory. We expect at least some potential explanations for that, not just piling observations up. But it's the other way around in terms of logic and theory. It also means you don't need to reverse engineer. If you found something in your data, well, tell us you found something in the data, and then tell us later what you think could be the explanation of that. Also, data mining, which you should really not do if you want to test hypotheses as well. No hypothesis. Which means for the introduction of an AMD paper, phenomenon forward. Start with something cool. Some people say, oh, indeed, that is surprising. I wouldn't have expected that. You need to convince your readers and, first of all, the viewers and editors that it's novel and interesting, and it's certainly not easily explained with existing field. Sampling and study design. Well, as I said before, I mean, we have statistically more qualitative than quantitative methods. However, this is that is not on purpose. It just happened. All methodologies are welcome, all empirical, I should say. So it's not a theoretical model journal. You can also sample, of course, you can purposeful sampling as you would also do in as normally qualitative research. So you can sample the DV. Just, of course, be aware what it means for the interpretation of your findings. So the 5% significance level means something else here. And it means if you really did the representative sampling and then hypothesis testing. So it is not, so yeah, in a sense, you would close the door on an argument or hypothesis if you try to exclude it or refute it. Hypothesis testing, here it's more opening the door. So this could be potential explanations. I can exclude ABC, but maybe not D and E. So let's see, but D and E are candidates. So that's the idea. It doesn't mean that just do, have a look here, have a look there. Rigor is important. It's so in terms of methods, AMD is from a noble family, if I may say so. So it's at least from a reputable and established family of journals, and of course has the ambition to grow up the full member of that family, which also means that we expect you to submit stuff with really good methods. In particular, I mean, talking about significance levels, as I said before, if you really have an hypothesis ex ante, collect your data, and then do the testing, then 5% significance level tells you the usual thing. But of course, if you sample by the significant effect, say, oh, look, here's something significant. What's behind that? Then, of course, the argument is different, because if you have 20 variables, just randomly, one of them is likely significant on the 5% level. That's exactly the idea of that. But you know what I mean, right? So in a set of random variables, 2 of them will be correlated. It's large enough. So that's the point. This is why you need to interpret significant stuff differently. And in a sense, it's even more rigorous, more demanding. We would expect you to do things like try alternative methods, resample, add more variables. Well, in any case, it's not, the different approach does not at all mean that you can be less demanding on methods than in other journals from that family. Data should be detailed, rich, and complex so that you can really understand what's going on and come close to, if not totally prove, causal relationships. Yeah, so tightening the explanatory web around there normally. So could it be that? Could it be this, etc.? And then showing, like solving a criminal case. Let me come to what I do. I still have a bit of time. Concerned, yeah, I'm rambling too much. I want to give you a few examples and one in a bit more detail. That's a paper that my former doctorate student Philipp Hartmann and I published in AMD in 2020, which actually got me into AMD. Not because that's the very best example, but just I know it pretty well. But I also think it makes a nice point about diversity of methods. So it's called The Rise of Corporate Science and AI Data as a Strategic Reason. As you see here, the highlighted part of the abstract, the point is exactly this. And that was really, I remember the moment when Philipp came to me and said, he was actually studying AI from a different perspective. But he said then, I found that corporations do basic research in AI and they do more of that over time. As you may know, there's been a paper by Ashish Arora and co-authors that I think the SMJ, it came out a few years ago, pointing out the exact opposite. So in nearly all industries, corporate science has been going down, also in IT. And so Philipp's observation, and that was exactly what AMD wants, was like, look, it's going up here. Why? So that was a discovery. And indeed, somewhat surprising, because, I mean, if IT was different from cars, I would believe that. But why would AI be different from cryptography or something like that? Yeah, so there's a question here. And so the yellow part shows a little bit part of the data work. So first of all, establish the phenomenon. What do Google, Facebook, etc. do in terms of publications, hiring researchers, and then we're making this point, conventional explanations don't work here. And what I liked about this is also we're using a bunch of different data sources. So first of all, of course, publications at major IT conferences and citations of these papers in later work to show, yes, there is a phenomenon. They are publishing more. And then also to show, no, it's not that they're just pushing out lots of bad stuff, lots of bad papers. Actually, if anything is the opposite, they are more highly cited than the non-corporate publication. Then biographies of AI researchers. So what about people? Are they also attracting people? And when turns out they're really selectively attracting top people after they have become well-known. Patents. We added patent data because it could be, and here it comes this point about potential explanations. Potential explanation could be that just publishing stuff that is commercially not particularly valuable. And one way to see that is if papers are being cited in patents as so-called NPL, non-patent literature references. And if an academic paper is cited by a patent as an NPL, it means that this patent is close to something, this publication is close to something commercially interesting, which is then protected through the patent. And indeed, that was the case. It was not the case. So they had a bit more citations as NPL. Another point, you could argue that, well, these companies, they don't mind publishing their stuff because they anyway have it patented before and it's covered by patent. So anyway, they can exclude others, even though they publish it. Again, not quite convincing, as we show, because, as you may know, the major AI frameworks like TensorFlow from Google, they're open source, they're freely available. You can use them anywhere, even if they have patents, but it's partly a protective thing, partly defensive, etc. So another one, acquisitions. It could be that corporations just can't anymore, as they do in other fields, rely on acquisitions, on external knowledge. So we checked acquisitions to see if that's the case. No, it's not the case. Acquisitions are actually quite active in acquiring in AI. So we can refute that explanation as well. Then we wanted to have a qualitative view, did a survey among AI researchers identified through their publications, and to understand what makes it attractive for them. And finally, our post-explanation was that data serves as a strategic asset, and not only to protect, like a complementary asset in the David T's sense, but also as an asset required to do R&D in the first place. Because if you can't test your AI framework with a large enough data set, you can't develop it in the first place. So that's one reason why the top researchers go there. So hopefully that gave you some idea. Now quickly, 3 more papers and then I'll be done. Just give you an idea of the breadth of stuff. This paper, Barnett, Hartman, and Solomon, have you been served? Extending the relationship between corporate social responsibility and lawsuits. 3 different sources of data, a database about essentially CSR performance of publicly traded firms, litigation data, and the usual Thomson Reuters word scope for financial stuff, methods, panel regression. And now I'm really focusing on the methods, not the outcome. Yeah. This is pay for performance and employee mental health, large sample evidence using employee prescription drug usage. The data, they first did a survey on pay for performance among 1,300 Danish firms. And here, if you ever want to work with person level data, find a co-author in Scandinavia. It's totally incredible the amount of data they have. Every data protection person in Germany would get a heart attack immediately. So they had wage, demographic, and medical prescription data for 318,000 employees. So even the antidepressant prescriptions they got. It's kind of anonymized, but still, and the data is highly protected, but it's there, it's collected, and you can access it. And then with a diff regression, they found then indeed, which is really quite concerning, 4% or so increase in the prescription of antidepressants and related stuff after pay-for-performance introduction. So, well, but that's the kind of stuff, I mean, as a hypothesis testing paper, that wouldn't be thrilling, right? If you say, well, I assume that pay-for-performance increases something, increases anxiety, etc. So let's test that. Well, maybe you could. I don't know. But anyway, it was presented that way and it fits very well. Finally, about epiphanies. suddenly everything became clear, how people make sense of epiphanies surrounding their work and careers. Very Dane. So like sudden recognition that, oh, this is how I should, etc. This kind of thing. Based on a survey first and then interviews. So this is qualitative work and using grounded theory approach. I'm not going much deeper into the methods. I guess you know them. You can look them up in the books. My point is really the specific thing about AMD is the approach, the phenomenon, the surprising stuff, and then whatever method is suited, and maybe a combination of method to show first what is going on, and then to propose and test, not in the sense of hypothesis testing, but in the sense of plausibility, hypothesis, refute some, etc. That's it for me. And questions, I guess, we'll have at the end after the third presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Jonas?
So let me share my screen. Is that viewable for everybody?
Yes.
So yeah, I'm talking for the Journal of Applied Psychology. I think most people know the journal. So it's a relatively old journal, actually. I think it started publishing in 1917 or something like that. It publishes a wide range of types of papers. So there's not like a specific type of paper the journal is looking for. I think that's really also important in the sense that, for example, we have, I think, two major types of papers. One are feature articles and the other are research reports. And a couple of other types of publications like integrative reviews and comments, but they are much less common. And the research reports actually do not require that you also have always a theoretical contribution. So it can also be an empirical paper. And there are also actually methods paper published in the journal. So it's from time to time, people actually also publish like what they would maybe also publish in organization research methods, also in like JAP. So yeah, editor-in-chief is Lillian Eby, and we have like a big team of people. There's also a large number of submissions. So you cannot really predict well who you get as an associate editor. And I think the majority of the paper is still like quantitative work. And I also have a quantitative background, even though I have reviewed also some and also edited some qualitative papers, but like my background is more in quantitative methods. And I thought a bit about how you can clear methodological hurdles in the publication process. And I think it's, of course, depends a lot on what type of method you have. But I think there are a couple of themes that come back many times and that I also observed when I work with papers and authors. And I think a couple of those can really be things that you can maybe remove before you submit. I think one thing that I see all the time is like the theory model complexity. And authors frequently get carried away and then come up with a very complex model. And I think you can ask yourself, what is an appropriate number of hypotheses that you have in your paper? Do you need 2, 4, 8, 15, 30? I've seen everything. So I think there's probably a sort of curvilinear relationship between the number of hypotheses and what is maybe possible in one paper. And of course, it also depends on the complexity of the effects. So it maybe depends on the type of literature you are in. But I think a good advice always when you want to clear methodological hurdles is that you do not put too many hurdles in your way, so to say, by just having an overly complex model that is very difficult to test. So maybe focus more on explaining why what you're testing is relevant than making it overly complex. And I think that's really like an advice that I frequently also see when researchers start out. I think when people are more senior, they get a sense of, okay, that's too much for one paper. But I think especially when you're more junior, you get, I think their strength is that you get really deep into your data and everything seems important. But I would really think about how can you reduce the complexity that you can still bring your message across. Reviewers generally have a short attention span. That's my experience. So they read it, and you have like 3-4 minutes, and then they need to kind of understand what you're doing. And when that's not possible, they frequently are not really motivated to really deeply look into it. There are many reviewers who do great work, but I think also reviewers also have some sort of demand view that they want to have the relevant information, and when they really need to start searching for it, you make it kind of difficult for them. I think one point to also be aware of is that papers tend to increase in complexity during the review process. So a lot of people actually look into the journal and say, okay, I submit a paper which is like in similar in complexity, but maybe when they submitted it, it was a much more simple one. So take into account that the reviewers likely will demand more analyses, some robustness tests, which will make the paper longer and more complex. So I think a good thing can be to kind of think about how you can bring your message across, and I would maybe make it more simple than you think. And then sometimes it can be better to like develop the paper together with the team. And that's also like one of the goals of the journal, to have like constructive review process and develop work in ways that you can say, okay, maybe this is also something that you can add some robustness analysis, supplementary analysis, exploratory in some way. So leave some room for that. That would be my recommendation. The second hurdle is, I think, is the fit between theory, the hypotheses, and the analyses. And I think that's really one thing that's always stuck out to me, is when you have the theory and it's difficult to move from the theory to what actually is a prediction, then it's already an issue. And the next issue occurs when then you have a problem for moving to the prediction to the actual analysis. And what I like to do or recommend is always like a sort of, we do that when we have language. For example, we have items, we do a back and forth translation. And I always recommend that for theory and analyses. So what would be the analysis to test the theory? What would be the hypothesis that you could test with this analysis? And when there's not a really close match between those, then it's typically difficult to convince reviewers. So what I would really always recommend, try to give someone your hypothesis and ask them, how would you test this? Or show them your model and say, what is the theoretical prediction? Or sometimes tell them what is your theory and then let them guess what is the hypothesis, and so on. So I think the fit between these three is really crucial in predicting whether a paper will fly or not, and what can be really a problem. And sometimes it's also the case that you really need to translate your theory into the method and increase this fit. So I think that's really important. Another thing about this is sometimes people also use constructs in their theorizing that they do not actually measure. And that's a very common mistake. And I think it gets always flagged all the time. So what I would really always recommend is that you really focus on the things you actually measured and kind of try to improve the fit between those. I think also, yeah, sometimes what you see is that people also simply ask some question they think is interesting, and they are frequently right, the question is interesting, and then search for some method. But sometimes there does not really exist a good method to test it, and they use some other method. So I think that's also really an issue that you sometimes see, and then sometimes you need to change the question also to be able to answer the question. Another thing is establishing the method. And I think sometimes people want to be innovative, but innovation when it comes to methods, unless it's a methods paper, is not always a good thing. So in a way, conservatism is sometimes good to get a paper across, because in principle, the method you need people to trust your method. And I think it's always good when you have a history of the methods. Maybe there are some similar papers in the field that use the same method. I would always say cite them, even when it's not the same topic, because it increases like trust in the methods you're using. Then I would always say, try to find a methods paper on it. And these days we have actually Journal of Applied Psychology sometimes publishes methods papers. Organization research methods publishes methods papers. And when there's a method paper with best practice advice, that's really helpful, because then you can say, okay, I'm really following what is the state of the art in the field. And that can be really helpful in convincing your reviewers. On the other side of things, what I also sometimes saw is that people just use the method because it has been published somewhere in management in the same way. And of course, the fact that something is published is not a guarantee that it's also correct. So I would also say be a bit critical of it, and do not assume that everything that is published is also like the perfect way to do it. And really try to build on the methodological literature. And I think one thing which is really great about management is that we have an increasing methodological literature that gets more advanced, and there's more like solid advice available, workshops where you can get the information. Then one thing that I would always stress is transparency about the method. So JAP has really made an effort to increase the transparency. And sometimes people think, okay, maybe when I share my code, when I explain too much about my method, maybe they see something that is not correct or something like that. But my experience is it's like the opposite. So I think especially people who have experience with methods, they really want to see what you did. And in being transparent about it, you actually increase your chances a lot, because they will trust what you did and they can also help you with it. And when you don't share it and they need to figure out what the actual method or model was, then you're already taking a lot of their time, and you make them less willing to work with you. So I think that frequently, especially sharing code, writing out the formulas, explaining exactly what you did, why, will only help you and increase the chances. So that's, I think, the way you should typically see it. I think another problem is that I see frequently when people try to submit papers is they think about confounders. Yeah, so you have one core method and then maybe something that can be a threat. Attrition, missing data, common method bias, self-report bias, measurement error, endogeneity, and so on and so on. It's a long list. I think one advice is typically not everything is a threat for every study. There does not exist a perfect study. So I think you need to make a compromise and try to focus on what you believe is really important. And then, basically defend your choices. And on the other hand, I think it does not help to totally overload in terms of being concerned about all types of threats, because no study is, of course, perfect. So I think that's also the sort of balancing issue. And sometimes it helps also to be aware what is really a threat and what is not necessarily a threat. I think another hurdle that I sometimes see is that people overinterpret their data. So the unfortunate aspect of significancy tests is that they do not tell us as much as we sometimes would like to know. So for example, what sometimes I've seen is that people kind of have like 10 significancy tests, and then they identify some sort of pattern. These types of tests are always significant. These are not significant. But of course, the difference between significant and not significant is not significant necessarily. So I think sometimes this type of overinterpretation is really critical and can be a bit of a threat when people like expect this one is significant, this one is not, or they see some patterns in their data. And one unfortunate aspect about empirical data is that it can be muddy. And I think it's important to stay within the framework of the epistemological theory. So for example, Neyman Pearson theory, when the effect is not significant, it's not significant. You cannot say it's half significant or something like that. So I think that's sometimes really important to be aware what the method actually tells you and what it does not tell you. So that's something I've seen also sometimes in people using methods, is this tendency to overinterpret and see something behind the data that the data maybe cannot tell you. Some concluding thoughts. I think one point is, I think it's really important to sometimes pitch the research question more than the result itself, because the result is also like a probability thing. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not. And I think that design quality is in generally something that is underestimated as a way to get published. So a lot of people think I need to have an interesting finding, it needs to contribute to theory and so on. But what I've seen is that frequently when people come with really great data sets and a really rigorous design, it's a good way to convince reviewers. And they really sometimes also just want to have the paper because they think it's a really strong design that contributes to the field, where we really know something that we didn't know before, even when the results are not always super clear. So I think that's maybe one advice that I would give people: have trust in your design and try to develop the best study you can do. And yeah, ask the question how you can ideally test this with when you would have all the resources, and then come as close as you can. And I think another point about hurdles, of course, the metaphor of hurdles is, I think it's a great metaphor. On the other hand, in the end, sometimes you convince the reviewers, but maybe you still made a methodological mistake. So the fact that you convince the reviewers does not necessarily mean that everything is done perfectly. So also the reviewers are not responsible for your research. So also some papers that are published are not necessarily perfect. So I think in the end, you also kind of need to be responsible for your work beyond the review process. But of course, the reviewers can help you, the editorial team can help you to improve the work. That's a bit of summary of what I would say. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So just going back to your last comment about like reviewers can't catch everything, right? So it was just, I'm not sure if everyone is aware of what's happened over the weekend with the Harvard professor and those data manipulation and that. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, why such a thing might even happen, right, at the first place. And then maybe like as reviewers or as editors, what are the ways that because as a reviewer myself, I can maybe do some stuff, catch some stuff, like for simple models, I can calculate degrees of freedom, right, to see if that model was run accurately, right? But I cannot catch some of this stuff. So what would you say? What would you do in these situations?
Is it a question for me?
Well, everyone.
I mean, I can say something.
Yeah.
I mean, we have increasingly data transparency or demand for data transparency, but if somebody is really set to manipulate data, how can you tell? I mean, if you did a survey and say, oh, I'm just missing the significance level, so let's tweak a little bit. It's very hard. I mean, we could just continue preaching that should be honest, etc. Maybe also get less excited about the 5% level. SMJ, as you know, is not publishing the stars anymore, just p-value. And there's actually empirical evidence for that. I don't know if you saw the distribution of p-values in regressions. There's a bump at 5%. So people apparently, be it selection, be it manipulation, maybe playing with the control variables, whatever. So in any case, and if you think that it's maybe about tenure to get something in that journal or not, well, this is there is quite some pressure. But the more it is important to tell people, especially young people, please don't do it. Please be honest about that. And also, I mean, I would echo what Jonas said about the setup of an experiment, the research question on an experiment of a study. Sometimes that's really the coolest stuff. And then if something turns out not to be significant, that shouldn't be, and that goes to the editors, obviously, that shouldn't necessarily be a reason to say no, thank you. And that also would alleviate a little bit that pressure of manipulating stuff to, I didn't know exactly what she did, but kind of ironic that you're studying, honestly. Yeah. So that's one thing. And you had a second part of the question, but maybe the others want to say something first about that. manipulation stuff.
You want to
Oh,
go
yeah.
ahead, Beth, or?
Sure. I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, so the issue I think is less relevant. Although I will say, you know, when you think about working collaboratively with other people, we all don't always, I don't look at every page of my co-author's data when I work with them. So they could be manufacturing quotes and I would not know that, right? Which I think is kind of the equivalent. I do think that, you know, there's sort of broad issues here that, like the thing about getting tenure, or like what are the pressures to publish now that it make people potentially push people to fudge things. I think we, you know, I would agree, it's hard to say what can you do about that. I think the move towards data transparency that you're seeing in all of our journals is a way to keep some of that in check, but you can't account for people who lie. I mean, frankly, like I have no, I'm not saying that I don't know anything about the case. I've read in the New York Times, but I do think that it can be difficult to fully know your co-author's data. And so, I mean, of course we can say like, be careful who you work with, but it's not always that obvious.
Yeah, I would say what I already said. I think it's important for any field to really ask interesting questions and then just be open to whatever the result is. And so think about what type of study could be interesting, so interesting that you just want to know the answer, whatever it is. And I think when just the result is interesting, it's also a certain type of research that you're doing. So I think care more about the design, and then maybe the incentive is not there for the field to actually do things like that. This being said, I think just one point to add, I think there's also a long history of fraud cases in science. So you can go back to, I think, more than 100 years. It happened all the time. It happens again. Of course, the field needs to do as much as possible, but I think it's not possible to generally prevent it. And I think there's a long history of these types of cases. It's sad, but it's also a part of science. And yeah, I think it's part of the process in a way. But of course, we can improve.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Jonas, in the field of psychology, actually, as far as I know, more common even than in management, but it's also something that AMD welcomes. It's a pre-registered study. So you're writing a paper and you're writing just the front end. So you're saying, okay, so here's a field I observed. Maybe for AMD, you would need some observations, but you don't go into the data collection yet. You just say, okay, I'm planning to do the following data collection, and I'm planning to do the following analysis. And you motivate the question. And for some other journal, it would also mean you derive hypotheses theoretically. And you swear solemnly, I haven't collected the data yet. And then the journal would say, provided you do the analysis correctly and according to the rules, but if that's so, we accept your paper, however many stars you might find in the end. And that's also a cool way to avoid hierarchy, which is not, I don't know how frequent it is. It's, in any case, it's a possibility that we encourage people to do.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you all.
If I may,
Yeah,
what was the second point about reviewing? You said when you are reviewing, I wanted to make a general point for the audience about really how you should appreciate reviewers. So writing a good review can be a huge amount of work if you really dig into the stuff. I mean, sometimes it's relatively quickly done, but with the not so good papers. With those that are excellent is also not so much work, but those that are a bit critical, where it's not quite clear if there's some bug in the data, and to really look into that. So I've had reviewers, both as another reviewer when I was reviewing, but also as an editor, I said, wow, this guy was really digging deep. And also as an author, I said that, I said, wow, really grateful for that comment. So some people do a lot of work. And so one more reason why you shouldn't annoy reviewers with sloppy manuscripts, typos, that kind of stuff. And also don't be too angry if they, in the end, don't like your paper, but it's a lot of work to do this well.
Yeah, I would like to just add, I think you talked about detecting fraud, and I think even though this case happened, and many cases happened in the past, but I hope it's not too frequent, I think as a reviewer, you should ultimately try to trust the authors and have a positive attitude, and not try to always like think, okay, probably this data is fake or something like that. I don't think it's such a frequent phenomenon. I also think that reviewers, when data is really like changed or manipulated, I doubt that reviewers are always able to see it and detect it. And I doubt also that this is really like the task of reviewers to do that.
Good to know, because it's always in my mind on what I can actually do to make sure that everything's right, but I guess it's not always possible. Well, thank you all. I'll go ahead and work on and see the questions that attendees has been asking. You all have access to these questions, but I'll ask them in order. So this question is for Beth. They ask, does ASQ concerns the year of data collection?
I think we have, I think basically what we like to see is as much, you want to provide as much context about your data to the reader as possible. So if that is, so I typically report the year of data collection because I do ethnography. So I'm in the field from this time to that time, and I write that in my methods section. I don't know for quantitative papers that that's a real concern. Maybe other people have an opinion about that, but I think from a qualitative perspective, and more generally, I think for most of us, and especially related to this question of data transparency, what you want to do, I think we've all kind of said this, is really present your data in a way that the reader understands. What's the context of this study? What do I need to know in the background to understand your findings? And that the year of data collection can often be a part of that, especially for qualitative work.
Perfect. Jonas, Joachim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree that it's also important for quantitative because it's, of course, a context in a way. I think for some research question, it's not so likely that it will change the result. So, for example, when you think about certain personality differences and job performance, I would not think that this has a lot of influence on it. But of course, for other research question, I think it makes perfect sense that it has an effect. For example, when you would like do a study on video conferencing before the pandemic and after the pandemic, right, the behavior may have changed a lot. So in that sense, I think it can be an important part of the information, but I doubt that papers regularly request this. So I think, it's something to think about in the field.
Brief addition. So, I mean, I might be a bit surprised if it's 10, 20-year-old data. So, I don't know, maybe they tried all sorts of things in other journals, and then it comes to my desk. But but that's maybe not the main problem. It shouldn't be, actually. But the other point is, as Jonas, I think, said, some things may change over time. So pre or post COVID with conferences. Another point is, I mean, sometimes the phenomenon is also, if you have a new phenomenon, that's not enough to write a paper. But if you have an interesting question in a novel setting, that is a plus for selling your stuff. So if you write about explainable AI currently, it's a better time now than in 5 years from now. So, or partly because many more things will have been written by then. But it's also, if phenomenon is new, it does better.
Perfect. Thank you. So this question is a little broad, so I'm not sure if it's easy to answer, but is there a rule of thumb on how to determine the scope of your research project intended for publication? So if you have anything, because I'm not sure if it's easy to answer this, I'm not sure if what they actually mean, but if you have anything to say, please say. Otherwise, I'll ask. I'm asking the submitter to provide additional information. Yes, Jonas.
Joachim, go ahead. No, I think, yeah.
Well, I think, Carolina, if you're a young researcher, I suppose the rule of thumb is make it more narrow. because it's the usual tendency, not only for young researchers. I mean, it happened to me once with a paper we submitted somewhere, and they suggested it was a good idea to split it up into two. Now we have two papers. Nice. So,
Yeah.
And it was a very senior co-author even. So very often we start with too broad a view, but
Right.
then also over time you get some feeling for what is.
Yeah, I would maybe add that I think typically you can maybe have 1, 2 contributions or things you want to say or bring across. But as soon as the list becomes 3, 4, 5, then it's probably too much. So that's just so intuitively independent of what you're trying to say, but just for a research paper, I think you need to have like 1 or 2 big statements, and the rest is kind of a side aspect of it.
I agree.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So the next one is for Dr. Becky. Could you talk a little bit about presenting qualitative work for ASQ? Are there any key things ASQ expects or prefers to see from qualitative papers in terms of presentation and writing, for example, presenting codes in text or table, data tables and figures, etc.? I guess it's addressed to Beth, but the other two, because you're also managing qualitative papers as well, maybe. So if you could chime in as well.
So I think, and I think this is applicable across lots of journals too, but I think it's really important to remember with qualitative research that your text is what is doing the convincing of the field, right? So the reader wants to see your data in the text. I think there's been a push in recent years to have lots of tables with data, and data tables are helpful, but if you don't describe and explain your data in the text, the reader is doing all of their interpretation on the basis of unexplained stuff in the tables, and it's different. So there's no, I don't think there's a template or even a set of rules or norms that I can give you about this, but just to say that like data needs to be interpreted by the author and delivered to the reader in a way that the reader can understand it. So if you have a table with supplementary data, that's great, but there should always be 2 or 3 examples of your construct or concept in the actual findings section written out where you can explain, here is this example, and then actually say, here is how it exemplifies what I am trying to tell you about this construct. So you want really, really explicit, clear linkages in the findings section with nice, juicy examples, more than one usually for each construct or concept, right? You've got a finding and you're showing me how these different things are related to one another. You need to lay out data for each of those steps of the relationship and give an explanation of it such that the reader can understand it. And so I always tell people, you're not convincing me by what you say in your method section. I don't care how many pages of field notes you took or anything like that. What I want to see is multiple good, juicy examples in the findings with a very clear explanation of how they exemplify what you're trying to say. And if you want to have tables and figures as sort of supplementary, that's great. And they can be helpful, but if you don't explain them in the text, you've lost me. Sorry about that.
Perfect, thank you. Jonas, Joachim, do you have anything to add?
I think it was a great explanation. Nothing to add. I agree. This is.
Yeah. I think you need the data table stuff and the construct schemes, but which also links to the next question a little bit, but you want to really have it in the text, yes.
Oh, perfect. So the next question is directed at Joachim. How do you show evidence of rigor in qualitative research? But I guess others are also welcome to respond.
Yeah. Sorry. I hope you could hear me well. My microphone was on the side. I mean, it's just get a textbook about qualitative research, but it's and look at a few nice papers. So data tables and the first, second, third level constructs, they should be nicely explained. Then in the coding, you should have multiple coders, and you should have really the standard thing like a code book for having really having really clear descriptions of what you code as what, and then measure intercoder reliability, which of course can be problematic. Right now, we're actually coding something where the coding is binary. So we need to decide if some licensing happens on such a level of the value chain or a different one. So it's binary, and there is virtually easy. If you categorize quotes into a tree of categories, good luck in everything ahead of it. Anyway, just see how it was done and do it. Have somebody, your co-authors, or if you can get student assistants, do that carefully and discuss how you do that, etc. I'm not a super qualitative researcher myself, but I think that's the minimum you need to do. Maybe Beth, you want to add?
Perfect, thank you. Beth, do you have anything to add, possibly?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what purpose you're doing the coding for, right? So if you're trying to turn qualitative research into, like if you're trying to develop theory from a set of data, that's a different strategy for, kind of using qualitative methods than if you're trying to convert it to a way to test something, right? And I do think that, so in the case in ethnography, you're not going to expect to have multiple coders, right? It's one person's interpretation of the data. So I think it varies quite a bit. And so in terms of rigor, you do want to think about like, if I'm going to do QDA, I have a certain set of rules that I'm going to use. If I'm going to, use interview data, and I agree. I think it depends on the use to which you put the qualitative data. But in terms of theory development, what you definitely want is an evidence of coding. So, what are the categories I came up with? And let me give you some examples of how you got there, right? And so really explicitly laying out, some people use a table. I don't think that's a hard and fast rule, again, because I really think it's important to explain what you're doing so the reader understands. And with qualitative data, it's sometimes not really obvious in a table. How did you get from that quote to this category? It doesn't seem quite right to me, right? Also, I think these tables tend to promote a view that's like very list-like. And so what we're trying to develop in grounded theory is a set of relationships. So you need to show how the categories are related to one another. And you can't really do that in a list of codes, right? And so the more important thing, really, and I've said this before, so I won't belabor it, put it in the text, show me how these things are related to one another with examples.
Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, this is also for Joachim. Designing research for AMD seems very intriguing, but risky, especially early career. Since it's such a different framework and approach, what happens if you don't get into AMD? Is the work still publishable?
Yes, so I would say yes. And as I said earlier, I think more journals have become more open toward exploratory research. As I said, I'm currently have a paper on review of revision for SMJ, which is of that nature. So no, that's not a one way. Actually, AMR is a different matter in that regard. So AMR papers are more unique in this. Yeah. So I think it's not a problem.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess this question's for the three of you. Are there any appeal procedures for authors who thinks reviewers did not thoroughly examine the paper? Do journals collect feedback on the quality of the reviews from the author? If not, why? Go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, for the Journal of Applied Psychology, there is actually an appeals procedure, and you can actually look at the document. I think the editor-in-chief, she published it also at her website, Journal Editors Corner. And what you can do in case you get a rejection decision is you can actually first appeal to the associate editor. And when you're not happy with that decision, you can appeal to the editor-in-chief. And then you can also appeal to the APA Board of Publication. So you have 3 possibilities to appeal. And yeah, the question is always to what degree this is worth the effort. And I think on the other hand, sometimes there's also like a routine appeal possibility. For example, when you have actually collected additional data, then you could actually appeal and say, now I can address all these concerns. That's actually an appeal that is quite frequently successful. And also sometimes when a reviewer simply just maybe overlooked something. So it's not that these appeals are always not successful. I would probably, as an author, give you the recommendation not to routinely appeal every decision. So when you have a good reason, I think there's a good chance and you should do it. But I would not use it as a standard career strategy, probably. Also because frequently maybe it's additional work, and maybe just submitting elsewhere or working on the paper can also be, like, on average, there are exceptions, be easier. On the feedback on the quality of the reviewers, actually, the Journal of Applied Psychology always asks the AE to rate every review. So very detailed statistics on how actually the reviewer is doing. It's not common to ask the authors. I think partly also because this is a lot of additional thing to ask. So I think there has not been a systematic procedure to do that. And it's typically easier to do it from the AE. But I would, especially when you really feel that a review was like not a good tone, or you felt there was something really off in it, I would always recommend to also tell the journal about it. And actually also the Journal of Applied invested a lot of effort and time into training reviewers, giving feedback to reviewers, making sure that the quality of the reviews is good, and also kind of developing reviewer talent, trying to be constructive, helping authors to develop the paper, even when it's not a revise and resubmit, so that they can do something with it. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome, thank you.
Can I add a couple things?
Yeah, of course.
I think I would completely agree, and I would add that you need to remember that these reviewers are your friends and colleagues, right? Like, we are all part of the same community, and reviewers, I find, put in a ton of work into reviewing manuscripts, and we do spend a lot of time kind of thinking about what's the quality of the reviews that we get. I used to keep a separate, when I first started as an editor, I kept a separate list, because even if I thought the review was fine, if I didn't love the tone or I didn't think the person was thorough enough, I made a note to myself saying, maybe this isn't the best person to choose for this kind of manuscript, right? So like keeping track of reviewers, but also like what I learned as a doctoral student from one of my dissertation committee members was, give yourself a few weeks when you're, as an author, when you get a manuscript back, give it a few weeks, put it aside, take a few deep breaths until you're emotionally ready to deal with what your reviewers have told you, because it can feel really awful. And we have to develop kind of a thick skin about people reviewing our work so that we don't take it personally. Sometimes you think maybe the reviewer didn't do a fabulous job, but a month later when you look at it, you realize, you know what, they saw something different than I saw. maybe I actually didn't get my point across in the way I thought I did. And you'd be surprised at how you get a little perspective and you realize, no, they actually did do an okay job reviewing my manuscript, even if maybe the tone wasn't the best it could be, before you decide to appeal. We all have, all the journals have different, there are appeal processes, I think, at every journal. ASQ's doesn't sound like it's quite as formal as JAP, but we certainly have a process. And so you're free to use it, but again, you'll get a very bad reputation if you appeal every decision. So I do think it's important to realize we're all, the reviewers are you, basically, right? So cut them a little slack before you get mad. You had an earlier question, and I think it's worth, you haven't asked us it, but I think it's worth bringing it back because there may be some people on the call who are not as familiar with the structure of a journal, and they asked what the differences are between an AE, a DE, an SE, and I thought this might be the time to just slide that in terms of what the roles are, right? So an associate editor or senior editor, I think, are pretty equivalent across the journals. They have different names for them, but they're pretty much the same thing. And that's the person who actually handles the paper. At many journals, that's the person who picks the reviewers and makes a decision. A deputy editor, typically, we just started this role at ASQ because basically we started having deputy editors at journals because we're getting so many manuscripts that the editor-in-chief can't handle the flow and needs people to help them assign editors to manuscripts. And so at least at ASQ, that's the role, that's what the deputy editor does. They have a role, they have a senior editor or an associate editor role over a set of manuscripts. So they're just an associate editor also. They handle manuscripts. And when I say handle, what I mean is they're the person picking the reviewers, reading the reviews, making the decisions, and you're getting really in a letter from that person saying, this is what I decided. There are different degrees of centralization at the journals in terms of the amount of latitude and kind of how much coordination there is across the editors. In general, I've been an editor at Org Science and ASQ. At those two journals, you have the associate editors are independent editors, right? So when I make a decision, that's the decision. And if there's an appeal, the appeal might go to the editor-in-chief. And at that point, usually, I think what they do is they basically decide, if they decide to allow a new manuscript or something like that, the associate editor who handles it won't be handling it again, right? But in general, the associate editor at ASQ, I have full latitude to make the decision. So Christine is just like rubber stamping at that point.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you said, because I was just in another editorial panel like about a month ago, and there was like this difference across as well, right? So JAP, Lillian was like, okay, I do have the authority to change the decision of AEs, but I never do, right? But there was like OBHDP editor who was like, okay, I review every decision letter, and I might change because I want to be consistent across. So there are differences across journals as well.
Right.
Awesome. So the next question is, can you share some examples of things in a paper that can influence a reject versus a revise and resubmit decision as an editor? Jonas, you wanna?
Yeah, I think there are many things, of course, but I believe one thing that I also like mentioned in my presentation is just like the overall complexity of the paper. And I think frequently you get papers that have an interesting design, an interesting topic, but there's just so many things in there that it's probably difficult for the reviewers, and it's also difficult for the AE to basically see the light at the end of the tunnel when they would enter into a review process with it. So I think what you really can do as an author is kind of be clear in your communication, have a clear goal, what you want to communicate, be clear and transparent about the design, and then frequently you will get feedback, and maybe they will also like say, okay, it's an interesting topic, it's an interesting study, but maybe the theory does not always have enough support. So maybe keep the hypotheses, but maybe provide more theory to it, or maybe add another analysis as a supplementary analysis, or tell us more about this and so on. And then they try to work with you. Of course, it's important to keep do not change the results or findings, but basically help you in developing the manuscript. And I think that's difficult when it's just too complex. And I would say the design quality is also a major decision. So for example, when the manuscript you submitted is only self-report data measured at one point in time, the likelihood that you get a R&R is very low. And so frequently, the R&Rs are typically better design and more, I would say, more interesting topic, maybe more timely. It's also, of course, sometimes a bit what has been published in the last couple of years. Of course, the journal cannot publish only papers on one topic. So maybe when there have been, I don't know, 50 papers on the same topic in the last 2 years, at some point, the quality criterion for another paper on the same topic may be higher, or the expectation may become higher at some point. So I think that's also sometimes something that plays a role at some point, implicitly also in the way that reviewers react to manuscripts.
Interesting. Thank you. Beth, Joachim?
Okay, I think I would agree with all of that. And I would say there's been a little bit of a theme across us, if you can maybe tell, about kind of depth versus breadth, right? A paper that's kind of broad and sits up here is not as good as a paper that kind of narrowly has some depth so that it can make a theoretical contribution. I would say interestingness for me is important if the data is interesting. And so from a qualitative perspective, like good data in the text is going to tell me, yeah, this person has, because we're talking about grounded theory, right? So your theory can change, but your data probably, it's very hard to collect qualitative data. It takes a long time. You're not probably going to go out and collect more. So if you can show reviewers that you have an excellent, well gathered and rigorous design, again, I think is important, right? That you've collected really good data. You can do a lot with that data, and that's going to make a difference when I say, oh, do I think this person has the data to go back and do a reanalysis to be able to develop that more deeply? If they show us lots of data, I can be more confident about that. And that's, I think, the other thing. There's two things. One, again, the reason why I said friendly reviews were so important is because if you give your paper to colleagues ahead of time, they can tell you, no, this is too broad. You're all over the map. You need to focus. Here's where you should focus, right? So give it to people. Let them be your community and your audience before you send it to journals. They'll get it closer for you so that you don't get rejected, right? You'll get the R&R more easily if lots of people have seen your paper before you send it to the journal. And then also one of the things that I was taught as a doctoral student, that introduction makes a lot of difference, right? So again, we've all kind of said reviewers don't have a lot of time. You want to get them on board with you in the first few pages. So that means you should really craft those first few pages to show us, what is your question? Why is your question important? What is new and interesting and important? Why does it matter? In the front end of your paper, so that then we can say this person has a good idea and they're going to be able to pursue it in a revision.
Perfect. Thank you. Joachim, do you have anything to add?
Maybe a few things to add, but I agree with nearly everything that was said. So, I mean, obviously, if you have a bug in the paper that can be fixed, that could be done in an R&R. If it's a bug that cannot be fixed, it cannot. So, I mean, it's an obvious point, but if you do an experiment with a one-time opportunity, maybe at some big conference or etc., and you didn't collect enough data or not enough variables, you can't fix it, problem. So better think before. Or if you don't have in a test, an experiment, you don't have enough statistical power to show what you want to do. So if you need to calculate power and the number of observation units, then an experiment, don't be too optimistic. So that kind of stuff, that is super important, because there's nothing you can do if that's the problem in the review process. Another thing is, what I sometimes hate is this, and it comes back to this why I really like AMD, when people try to plug some theory front end onto something that doesn't fit. Where you see they have been exploring the theory box and say, oh, that looks like I could use that. And then they kind of try to explain, really getting lost, getting totally separated from the actual world. This is something I suppose not only me, but more people hate if that looks artificial just for the sake of theory. So really try to ask yourself, so what is really going on here in this company, in this organization, or in this collaboration, whatever? What's the point you can tell a manager or your parents if they're not from the field, yeah? Where they say, oh, that's an interesting question, rather than that theory hasn't been tested here, or I don't know. So sometimes some interpretations or operationalizations of variables seem rather forced because people want to make a link to some theory, and that's something certainly I'm allergic to, but I suppose many others too.
Perfect, thank you. So we've gone through all the questions. I want to encourage our participants to submit any question if they have an additional one. I'll just gonna ask a few questions myself. Let's say you have a reviewer who's giving you an advice that you think is incorrect, and you do not have any like suggestions from the AE on that matter. Well, how do you handle that? And do you have any like a good to-do way of like how do you deal with that in a like politically good way? Beth, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I think no question that you are going to have things in your paper that the reviewers are going to miss or not get right, or that you don't think is appropriate to do with your data, or you've gone in a different direction, right? So because you have 3 reviewers and an editor telling you what to do, you can never satisfy all of your reviewers. It's almost, I mean, we're so excited when you have 3 reviewers who all say the same thing. That's like incredibly rare, right? So most of the time what's going to happen is you're going to have 3 reviewers. One's going to have missed the boat about something. One you're going to love, and you're going to think these are the best ideas ever and I can totally do all this. And then there'll be ones that you're like, I can do some of this, but here's a reason why I can't do the other. Right. And so there's always going to be things that you want to say to reviewers that are going to be no, essentially. And I think what you want to do is to do it politely, but clearly, right? So here is why I'm not doing what you asked. It's for XYZ reason, and you have a clear set of reasons. Either, I sometimes will say, quite frankly, my data does not allow me to do this analysis. It's a great idea, but I don't have the data that shows it, right? From a qualitative perspective, that's okay to say, right? Like your data can't do everything, but you want to show in the spirit of revision how you did something to make the paper better. So I think the other thing is that a lot of times what the reviewer is asking for is a surface level thing, and underlying it, they have a larger question that they want answered. They're saying like, you're not rigorously showing me something here. And so what you want to do is really think about, what does this reviewer really want? Do they want me to do this nitpicky thing I don't want to do? Or do they want to show something different? And either it's more depth, or it's they don't agree with the relationship that you've shown and they think it's something else. And you need to be able to say, here's what I think it is. Here is the data that shows it. And let me explain to you why I didn't do it your way. I think it's completely fine to tell a reviewer, I didn't do it this way for this reason, but also reviewers do read your responses, right? So they're going to be some people can get really like up in arms about a particular thing. So you do want to be able to reply and say, don't skip it. Don't pretend it's not there, because if this person wrote it, they know they wrote it, right? So you want to be able to say, I'm sorry, this is what I did. Let me explain to you why I didn't do it the way you suggested.
Perfect. Awesome. Yes, Joachim.
totally agree. So polite, and even if they were nasty, being polite helps in not being rejected, and they still work for you, yeah, somehow. Yeah, sometimes they miss something. I mean, if it was a friend, say, hey, can you read the paper carefully? You can't tell that in a review. So you could say, well, we have addressed this point, or we had addressed this point briefly on page 10, and now we elaborated on. So we, as Beth said, just say, even if you don't do something, or if they miss something, you can still react somehow. And partly, if they missed it, maybe it was just hidden in the end of some paragraph about something else. So maybe that's the reason why they missed it, and you can improve on that. So that's one thing. And yeah, if you don't want to do something they suggest, explain why, but also think if you can do something else that maybe satisfies it, both for improving the paper as suggested, but also a little bit of face saving, rather than saying, "Oh, that was a stupid idea. I'm not." The reason, the argument, my data doesn't allow it, is yeah, it's sometimes just the fact. But of course, it's a problem potentially if the reviewer thinks that needs to be done. You say, I can't, well, then you're out in the worst case. So think carefully what that. And maybe one more thing. Recently, I with interviews, and I had a bunch of interviews with patent holders and with patent licensees. And they said, yeah, you don't have enough patent holders, get some more. So I did get some more, but I also got some more of the others. So sometimes it's nice to do a bit more than they ask for. Makes people happy.
Yeah, I think a lot of what things were already said. I think one thing that I would say is always tell in your responses first what you actually did. Because what I sometimes see is that people then write like one page why they didn't do a lot of things, but in fact they did do something. So I would always start, what did you do? And then explain why you didn't do certain things. And you can also sometimes explain why you didn't do it in the manuscript and not just in the response. So for example, we didn't do it because in this literature, there's methodological evidence that this is sufficient or something like that. So I think that would be my advice, to always start with what you actually did, try to do something with it and do it in the manuscript and not just in the response letter. And then when you do there's something that you didn't do, explain it in the manuscript also, and to the review why you didn't do it. And frequently then my experience is that reviewers are actually quite open to engaging with you when you see you did something with it, and did not simply say, I don't care, or it's a stupid comment or something like that. And try to never get defensive, always try to be constructive and do something with it, because even when the reviewer is not correct about it, or it's a misconception about your study, it's maybe also just what they got from the way the manuscript was written. And then maybe there's something in the manuscript that you can change to move towards them and avoid that someone else ends up with the same misconception about it.
Perfect. Awesome. So another question on the same vein is when, you have two reviewers who might have conflicting suggestions, right? And you don't have any ideas, don't have any recommendations from the AE on which path to go, and you could see it both ways, right? What would you do? Would it be appropriate to maybe reach out to the AE and ask maybe for their their suggestions on that? Joachim, do you want to go ahead and start?
I think you might be muted.
I don't
think I am. Can you
Oh,
hear me
there
now?
you are. I could.
Okay, weird, my microphone. So, yeah, you can reach. I mean, I had one case where I reached out to an editor, whatever. He responded by email, so not through the system. And I remember we had a back and forth. I was sitting on my sofa at home in the evening, and we were saying, "Oh, it's super effective and fast." So these people, I mean, in the end, it's your name as the author on the paper, but their name in a sense as well. Sometimes even literally accepted by management science does that. So they want to have good papers too, and so they want to help you, especially if they got contradictory reviewers. I mean, good editors, they would reconcile. But maybe they missed it, or you have, or depending on the editor, some don't. No, you can absolutely, you can go back. It gives a very good impression. And don't take 6 months, because then I will have forgotten. And maybe not the day later. Think about it, but after 2 weeks or so, ideally, if you see predictory stuff, and propose something, not just what shall I do, but please propose a solution, and ideally that the person just says, "Hey, go."
Thank you. Beth?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think, you know, in all of my R&Rs, I have a sentence that says, please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about this letter. And I mean that, right? Like, I encourage people to reach out, and I've even had conversations with authors whose papers I've rejected who've had questions. I think that I'm happy, because you can't put everything in a letter, right? It's a specific form of communication. You can't say everything. And I think we do try. I would agree that good editors try to reconcile these things in their letter. Sometimes it's not possible, sometimes, right? And so asking the question, and I completely agree, think about it, have a proposed solution to what you think is best, given that it's your project, right? And present that solution to the editor. And the thing that I wanted to add is that we can't guarantee anything as editors, right? So like, what you decide to do may still be unacceptable and might not work. Just because we say, yes, I think that's a good idea, does not mean that it's necessarily going to be implemented in a way that we're going to accept the paper.
Yeah, so at JAP, you can actually reach out to get additional information about the letter, so that the AE clarifies something like that. Clear advice on what to do is typically done within the letter. So typically, we avoid that you give outside of the review process a clear advice on what the author should do. So typically, it's like, yeah, they can reach out to get clarifications, but when they're like, a decision needs to be made, they should better do it in the revision. And what I would recommend to authors is actually to acknowledge the differences and say explicitly, you know, the other reviewer had this recommendation and we considered your recommendation, and then in the end we decided to do this. And I think that's understandable. And of course also editors can overrule authors, so reviewers. So when the reviewer says that's not sufficient, I disagree, then the AE may make a decision then and ultimately decide, okay, I go with what reviewer A or 2 or 1 or whatever says, and I do not go with reviewer 2 in this case. But I think my experience has been that actually reviewers are open to that and say, okay, yeah, that's what they did, and they considered my feedback, and in the end they made this decision. And I think they are typically quite open for that, as long as you are transparent about it and as long as you basically consider it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, I do not see any questions coming in. So one last question. So what is the one thing that you know now that you wish when you knew it when you were a PhD student or a junior scholar?
One thing?
No,
like many.
saying if you can think more, like I didn't want to put you like on spot. So whatever that you think you wanted to know, but so I'm just hoping that our participants can get some, more experience.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go.
I think one thing that I always thought is when I was a PhD student, that as I would get older, I would get less rejections, and all these people that are famous never get rejected at the journals at some point. And I can tell you that's not true. Even like the super famous people get a lot of rejection letters. And I think that's just one of the unfortunate things about the academic jobs. Yeah. There's many great things about it, but the rejection letters, they still hurt many years later.
So have realistic expectation, right?
Yeah.
Beth?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think this is why, yeah, you know, we're all getting rejected. You saw the rejection rates at our journals. Everybody's getting rejected. The first, you know, your first round is not always enough. And I think also like, there's noise in the process too, right? So I think you have another chat question about how can you not lose hope after rejection. There are a lot of journals, right? Like there's not just one journal, right? So there are a lot of journals, and sometimes it's about finding a home with the right audience and the right set of reviewers and the right editor. And so one way to not lose hope is to, again, we used to say put it in a drawer. We don't have to put it in a drawer, but put it aside. Give yourself a couple of weeks to, you know, feel a little bit less hurt, and take a look and say, well, where can I send it next? You know, and if you're not sure, ask your colleagues, where would you send this paper? Is this topic interesting to a particular set of people? Is what I'm doing in here, maybe it wasn't right for AMD, or maybe it wasn't right for AMJ, but it really would be right for AMD. Or maybe it's really more, maybe the psychologist would be more appreciative than the general orgs audience, or maybe sociologists, right? Like, so where do you send it such that it finds an audience? I have had my share of rejections. I don't have a whole lot of papers that never went anywhere, right? We do have a tendency, you can put projects in a drawer too and recycle them later on and think about what to do differently, right? So I think that's one way to not lose hope. And yes, there are as many, it's in the comments, somebody says there's not a lot of journals for qualitative papers. Really, all of the top management journals publish qualitative work. So I'm not sure that is necessarily true. I would say in psychology, there are fewer journals that have lots of qualitative work in them, but in sociology, there's a lot of qualitative scholars. So depending on what you do, there's the same number of top journals in management that publish qualitative as quantitative work. Don't lose hope. There's a home for your paper.
Awesome.
Well, from my side, so shall I?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
yes.
Good. So I recently drew this here on the whiteboard in my office when I was talking to the doctorate student.
We can't read it. Sorry.
Why is
Oh.
that?
There it is. There it is.
Unfair. I can't read that.
Topic writing journal, right? Okay, got it.
So it says topic writing journal. So there needs to be a fit between what you research. I mean, it's partly obvious, but also I was discussing today with a doctorate student. He is doing something with a co-author, and they haven't decided yet where to send it. And I think that's something, for sometimes you don't know, but it's good to know early on because that guides your writing. And so it needs to fit what you study, how you do it, how you write it up, and where you send it. That needs to be consistent.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciated your time here and your expertise. We really appreciate it. And I wish you a good rest of your week and good weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye and good luck, everyone.